Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
Examining the provisions invoked and applied during the trial is essential to assessing the legitimacy of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE. Legal scholar Neil Boyster, among others, cites U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas's perspective that the IMTFE was shaped more by political motives than by a fair application of existing international law. Article 5 of the IMTFE Charter defined the tribunal's jurisdiction over three categories of offenses. Class A, crimes against peace, planning, preparation, initiation, or waging aggressive war, or participation in a conspiracy to do so. Class B, conventional war crimes. Class C, crimes against humanity. Conventional war crimes, Class B, rested on well-established violations of the laws and customs of war, as codified in pre-war conventions like the Hague Conventions. In contrast, crimes against peace, Class A, and crimes against humanity, Class C, were far more controversial. Lacking clear, universally accepted legal precedent at the time, these charges were often criticized as ex post facto, retroactive, and politically motivated, designed to legitimize the prosecution of Japanese and earlier German leaders. Unlike the Nuremberg Charter, the IMTFE Charter made crimes against peace the central focus of the indictment. The tribunal treated this offense as the supreme international crime, containing within itself the accumulated evils of war. All defendants had to be charged under this category as a prerequisite for the tribunal's jurisdiction over the other offenses. According to the American delegation's proposed definition at the London Conference of 1945, a war of aggression was characterized by a state being the first to undertake hostile actions against another, including declaring war, invading its territory with armed forces with or without declaration of war, attacking its land, naval or air forces, territory, vessels or aircraft, imposing a naval blockade, or supporting armed bands that invade another state, or failing to prevent such bands from receiving support within its territory. No political, military, economic, or other considerations could justify such actions, though legitimate self-defense or aid to a victim of aggression was exempted. Under the IMTFE Charter, the indictment embodied the Allied perspective that Japanese aggressors bore sole responsibility for the Pacific War. The prosecution alleged that the accused had participated in the formulation of a common plan or conspiracy to achieve domination of the Far East through armed force and, in alliance with the Axis powers, eventual domination of the world. This allegation underpinned the core charge of crimes against peace, count 1 of the indictment. Historian Richard H. Manier, in Victor's Justice, the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, observes that the tribunal adapted historical and political circumstances from the German case at Nuremberg to fit Japan, thereby justifying the application of the broad conspiracy charge, despite significant differences in the two nations' contexts and leadership structures. For the United States, the Japanese leadership was deemed to have waged an unlawful war of aggression, beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The majority judgment held Japan liable for crimes against peace against both the United States and the United Kingdom. It found that, following prolonged but ultimately futile negotiations with the U.S. government, Japanese leaders conspired to initiate a war of aggression against the United States and the British Commonwealth. 18 of the 25 convicted defendants were found guilty on this count. The majority also addressed the surprise nature of the Pearl Harbor attack in relation to Hague Convention 3 of 1907, relative to the opening of hostilities, which required that hostilities not commence without previous and explicit warning, either a reasoned declaration of war or an ultimatum with conditional declaration. The convention did not specify a minimum notice period. Evidence showed that Japanese planners intended to deliver only about 20 minutes notice before the assault, which might have technically satisfied the narrowest interpretation of the rule. However, due to transmission delays, the formal notification reached U.S. officials after the attack had begun, rendering it a surprise assault in violation of international law and reinforcing the aggressive character of the war. The tribunal, therefore, convicted the defendants of aggression against the United States, not primarily because of the manner in which the Pacific War began, but because Japan's initiation and waging of that war, exemplified by the Pearl Harbor attack, constituted a war of aggression in violation of international law. The Allies viewed it as aggression because Japan, as a signatory to the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, Pact of Paris, had renounced war as an instrument of national policy. Article 1 of the pact explicitly condemned recourse to war for the resolution of international disputes and renounced it in relations among the signatories. The majority judgment held that Japan's leaders knowingly violated this binding commitment by planning and launching aggressive wars, rendering such actions criminal under the evolving principles of international law recognized at the time. Alongside the Nuremberg Tribunal, the IMTFE is now regarded as a foundational development in international criminal justice. It established the principle of individual criminal responsibility for core international crimes, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, setting precedents that influenced the later creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR. The Potsdam Declaration, 1945, underscored that the Allies sought stern justice against war criminals, but did not aim to punish the Japanese people as a whole. Rather, it targeted those responsible for aggression and atrocities. Accordingly, the tribunal imposed individual liability on Japanese officials for crimes against peace, primarily because the defendants knew, or should have known, that waging aggressive war contravened international obligations, including those under the Kellogg-Briand Pact. As a signatory, Japan was bound by the Pact's provisions, which the prosecution successfully argued criminalized aggressive war, holding the accused personally accountable for their roles in its planning, initiation, and conduct. The IMTFE rejected the defense that wars of aggression were mere acts of state, incurring no individual criminal responsibility. Instead, the majority judgment affirmed that international law imposes duties and liabilities upon individuals as well as upon states. Citing the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Ex parte Quirin, 1942, the tribunal emphasized that crimes against international law are committed by men, not by abstract entities, and only by punishing individuals who commit such crimes can the provisions of international law be enforced. Article 5 of the IMTFE Charter granted the tribunal authority to try and punish Far Eastern war criminals, whether as individuals or as members of organizations, for offenses including crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Article 6 explicitly provided that neither an accused's official position nor obedience to orders from their government or superior would, in itself, absolve them of responsibility for such crimes, though these factors could mitigate punishment if justice required. Justice Radabinod Paul dissented most forcefully from the majority, standing alone in rejecting the criminalization of aggressive war under pre-existing international law. He argued that the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 was merely a renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy, without criminalizing aggression or establishing individual responsibility. Powell famously remarked that only a lost war is a crime, underscoring his view that the legality of war depended on its outcome rather than objective standards. He further contended that Japan could legitimately invoke self-defense under the pact, a sovereign right he deemed inherent and not limited by implication. In Powell's opinion, the pact left the legal status of war unaltered, as the determination of whether a war was defensive remained a political decision for each state, not a justiciable legal question. Scholars such as Maria Xia Chang and Robert Parker have highlighted how the absence of a clear, universally accepted definition of wars of aggression was exacerbated by uncertainty in distinguishing them from legitimate self-defense. Critics of the Tokyo Tribunal point out that, until at least 1944, major powers, including the United States, Great Britain, and France, maintained that aggressive war was not yet a crime under international law, precisely because self-defensive wars could not be prohibited. Justice B.Y.A. Rowling, in his partial dissent, similarly argued that violence in self-defense, including responses to non-military threats, was still widely accepted, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact permitted each state to unilaterally determine what constituted self-defense and when the right could be exercised. Even assuming the pact outlawed aggressive wars, debate persisted over whether individuals could be held criminally accountable for state acts. Professor Knut Ibsen of Ruhr University echoed aspects of Powell's reasoning. While disagreeing with Powell that Japan's resort to war was legal, Ibsen concurred that the pact's renunciation obligation bound states, not individuals. He thus questioned the tribunal's jurisdiction over crimes against peace, deeming it doubtful. Rather than relying on the IMTFE Charter or the Kellogg-Briand Pact, Bernard invoked the European tradition of natural law, a higher, universal standard of justice rooted in reason and conscience, eternal and independent of positive law or tribunals. He viewed aggressive war as always a crime in the eyes of reason and universal conscience. Bernard's dissent thus rested on philosophical foundations, legitimacy derived from immutable moral principles rather than statutory enactments like the Charter. This approach paralleled post-war natural law arguments by scholars such as Gustav Radbruch, who, drawing on similar traditions, asserted that grossly unjust laws, for example Nazi legislation, were not true law and could be disregarded.